Hello everyone, welcome to Techies on Wheel. Today we will discuss about RPA coding best practices and how the code review is done in RPA field. So this tutorial is going to be a complete guide on RPA coding best practices. So let's get started. RPA coding best practices, we have heard, or you guys have heard these terms quite often, that while doing the coding, we should follow the industry best practices. So what are these best practices? These are just the standards which a developer is suggested to follow while developing the bot so that it is easy for the other developers to uh, go through your code or understand your code, or the support person who is going to take over your code for maintenance, it is easier for them as well. So if we just think it in the way that if we follow the same practices, the other person, the other developer would be also knowing that would have been done in the code, and hence it become easier. So there are a lot of benefits which comes if a developer follows the best practices, and this is why it is recommended to follow it, considering it's easy handover between developers to developer. It's fast support transition because again, the support person would be knowing your best practices. He or she would already be following it. So it's easier for taking the transition or support of that project. It is easy for the bot readability and maintenance purpose, and also it reduces development effort for similar process. So when I say reducing development effort, what it means is that if you are following the same structure and there is a similar process which needs to be developed, you can reuse that entire module or that project itself, making the changes to the structure to speed up your development timelines. And based on these best practices, the code review document is prepared. So we'll discuss in detail about the code review document, but for now, let's understand basically why these coding best practices are and what does it revolves around. So when we say coding best practices, we saw the benefits of it, but what exactly does it compromises of is very first thing, it ensures or helps the developer ensure that your code developed is compliant. Second one is the confined, which means your code should be confined enough. It should not be must staggered. We'll detail it around. It should be configurable. It should be reusable. It should be scalable, and it should be robust. So when I say compliant, it means that there should be no necessary storage of the client data. There are NPI and non-NPI data, which means the sensitive data or say credentials or anything which is having the data of client should not actually be hard coded, or the bot should be storing it in the defined process of processing, or even if it is using the data which is compliant related, it's deleting it just after the process is complete or the bot processing is complete. So it should follow. One developer should always follow this. Second one is security review. If your organizations ask for a compliance or security review, make sure that your code is reviewed thoroughly by the security team and is approved. Second one is confined, which means your code developed should be limited and should not use multiple lines of code, say example, wait or messages box, which are uh, not being really used in production environment. So while you are deploying the bot in production, make sure that these codes or unnecessary code lines are not there in the bot. It should be readable, which means that your code should have a proper commenting, and it should be in, it should, while you follow the structure, it's already that another person by default knows what's the way of coding or what would you have followed. So it helps there. And with the, of course, help of comments, it becomes easier for other person to understand your code. Next one is configurable, which means that as a developer or as a good developer, you should ideally follow that, make your bot the most configurable you can. Whatever you can take as an input from external source, or say, for example, the input file, if you hard code that value, the input file path in your bot, what will happen is that if say tomorrow the location client says that, okay, this shared drive folder is going to be, we are not going to place the input anymore in this folder. However, we are going to send the input file in some other folder. In this scenario, imagine that you have hard coded in your code the input file path. What will happen? The developer will have to, or the support person will have to change the path in the code, which means that again your code is getting modified, the version is getting changed, or you'll have to go through the entire process of approval from development to migration to the UAT environment, retesting it in UAT environment, and pushing it onto the production environment. However, versus when your code is configurable, there is an input file, uh, a configurable file or config file, which your bot would be referring to read that input file location. So in this scenario, what developer or the support person will have to do when if the client requested for the input file path change, will have to just go onto that config file and will have to change the path. So this makes a huge difference of if your code is configurable versus not configurable. So it's strongly recommended that always make your code the most configurable you can. Next one is reusable. Of course, your code should be as much modular as you can. For example, say if I'm working on a SAP application, so the login page or maybe the navigation code, these are mostly common. Even if say any other application, the login page is going to be common for any bot which is using or will use that particular application in future. So if you make a different module of login, you can reuse it as many times as you can. So make it modular so that your code is most reusable. And of course, your code should be scalable, which means that if say your bot is running on 2 machines today and tomorrow requirement increases, the input increases, volume increases, and your bot needs to run on 3 machines. So it should be easily scalable so that even without doing any code change, if you deploy the code in another server or system, it can easily scale and run on that system, that server. So how it happens, I'll give you an example. Uh, in one of my real-time scenario in one of my project, there was an input file and there were 2 bots which should which was required to run it to say 18 hours per day to process that entire volume. Now what I did as a developer or as a solution architect, how I designed the bot was very first thing which my bot used to do, I split it into 2 bots, the extractor bot and runner bot. Extractor bot, what it used to do is that it used to go to that application, download the input, which means the cases, number of cases, say there are thousands of cases, it downloads it, and then it used to split that particular code into 2 files. Now, how it's splitting into 2 files, it was not hard coded. It was that there was a config file which I provided. It used to read the input from there that how many files needs to be created. And basis that, it used to go and it used to divide the file into number of sub input files for the bot processing. And then the runner bot starts on both the machine and they used to pick their own input files, the sub input files created. In my scenario, when the volume increased and there was a requirement of third bot or third server to be placed for the bot run, what was required was that the support person just went there and changed that number 2 to 3. And it clearly, when the extracted bot ran, it got the input that, okay, now onwards, it has to split the main input file into 3 sub input files. And the third server ran onto itself with of course, the input file name was configurable. So no major changes was required and it was easily scalable. Hence, if your code is scalable, it's much easier for your client, for your process, and for anyone like who is involved in this entire RPA structure for maintenance, easy maintenance of the bot. Last one is that your code should be robust, which means of the scenario which I talked about, one extractor bot versus multiple run bot. So certainly it decreased the AHT because there were not the requirement of running multiple extractor bot. It was single extractor bot which was going on extracting the file, dividing into 3 parts, and all the runner bots was consuming it. Or the other one is the queue system, queue management systems. So these things, if you use, you're making your bot robust. You are avoiding the duplicacies of bot run or the process run, process execution. And of course, there should be a proper error handling so that just in case there is something which goes unexpected, say you're not informed and there comes a UI change or anything else which can impact your bot processing, your code should be properly written in a way of proper error handling that any new things observed which is not defined in the bot structure, if encountered, it clearly throws an error instead of processing the bot in the wrong manner. It happens, again, I'll give you an example where say you have created multiple modules, but what a developer did in one of the scenario in real life scenario, I'm telling you, the developer made the code very much modular, but what that person did while at the time of error handling is that if that module failed, he didn't take in account that if that module was very important for next module to get executed. But while he was error handling that particular module, what he did is that if in case that module failed, what would come out through an error, but it went into the another submodule for the run, which should not have happened actual. So in these scenarios, you have to be very careful that if there is a major step which the next step is dependent on, you should make sure as a developer that the code is best error handle. If that particular module fails, it directly comes out of the entire submodules. It doesn't execute the next module. Rather, it goes to the start of the loop or say some other starting point or retry point where it can re-execute those code again just to verify if that error still exists. And if it still exists, then it should throw a manual error or say any other exception which would have been suggested by the PA or the business in that scenario. So to sum it up, your entire coding best practices, which we will talk through in the coming minutes, is that it all depends on these 6 major, I would say, components. It should be compliant, confined, configurable, reusable, scalable, and robust. And if you make sure that you are following these 6 components, for sure your code is going to be as much best of the industry as you can think of. So moving on to the next one. We discussed about code review and we did discuss about this coding best practices. So what is this code review and who does it? We talked about it in our previous videos. So when a developer does a develops a code, there are 2 levels of coding review which is suggested. But before going on to that, I'll let us understand what is code review. So code review is nothing, it's just that a list of all the industry coding best practices at the command levels or the task level, and which is accumulated to evaluate whether the code developed by the developer is following those best practices or not, and the suggestions around it. And it also helps to maintain uniformity across organization. So there are organization to organization, there are frameworks which are defined. So if there are frameworks, that also comes under the best practices, coding best practices for that organization. So again, a code review document is nothing, just it comprises of all those list of standard practices, coding standard practices, and that document is used by developer and solution architect to go through your code and verify if those are being met in your code or not. So when I talk about code review document, it usually includes checklist, basis code category and subcategory. We will show you the entire document as well. The other thing which it contains is developers and solution architect feedback. So when I say that your code is reviewed by and it's suggested to review at 2 levels. First one is that developer itself goes through that document, code review document, and assess their code as a first level before going to the solution architect. Once developer is confident that he has follows almost all the coding best practices, that solution architect comes in picture, the essay, and reviews the developer's code just to ensure that yes, all the coding best practices are followed, and if not, any feedback which comes up from that review is listed there. So what it consists of? It consists of task name, number of instances. Again, number of instances are something which says how many times that observation has been found, action needed against that observation. So code review documents basically serves as an agreement between the RPA developer and solution architect on the development best practices of once the review is complete and signed off. It means that solution architect agrees that the developer has followed all the best practices and code is ready to move on to the next level, which is maybe which is UAT and then prod. So yeah, now let's have a look onto how exactly this document looks onto what are the features and what are the detailed level of the best practices or coding standards across the industry. So this is the document, and again, I'm referring to the standard document provided by Automation Anywhere for reference here. This is the code review document which captures first the process name, as this is the same document which is referred for almost all the processes. It's necessary to mention which process this code review is being done for, who's the developer, and who's the solution architect doing these reviews. Then comes the categories, subcategories, checks. Checks are the detailed level of your coding best practices. Task name, instance, and actions needed, day-wise for the developers and solution architect. So let's go through in detail. When we talk about category are kind of high level, I would say, split or modules onto which your entire code review involves onto. Very first one is on architecture level. The review is done on architecture level. How is the architecture of the board following the best practices or not? Then on the category wise, configurably, if it's configurable or not, it's how much debuggable your bot is, the general best practices, readability, security, and on testability, and any others. So these are basically the categories which we have taken in account, or Automation Anywhere usually mention as a on account of the categories through which, alongside which these code reviews are done. So talking about the subcategories in architecture, it comes on the command level, command hierarchy, design, duplicate code. Let's take it one by one. When we say commands, you have to make sure that there are certain commands which are having low priority, which should be considered as low priority of uses compared to the other commands. For example, I'll give you the object cloning, or now the recorder option of the if of the command of Automation Anywhere or any other tool you talk about. Image recognition or mouse clicks are always suggested as to be the last option to perform any set of action on the object. So as a developer, you have to make sure that your first level of command is working. And if it's not working, then only you should go on to the second level of uses of mouse click and image recognition. So this is what the check is being done. If, say, while doing the review, a developer or solution architect finds that, okay, this is not followed, and actually the object cloning or the recorder option is working better compared to the mouse click and IR, then which task it is, how many instances it has been found onto. Say example, there are two tasks onto which this issue has been found or this observation has been found. Those two task names are written here. Then the instances, like two instances, one in this task, one in this task, then that number of instances, and what action needs to be done. If it needs to be changed or it has already been changed, you need to mention here. Second comes is the command hierarchy, which means that your command is following the suggested hierarchies. If, say example, if the, try has to come and then catch has to come and then finally has to come, uh, or if has to be followed by else always, you have to make sure that these hierarchies are followed by. Also for the design, so like I mentioned, on different organization, they follow different frameworks or suggestions that needs to be followed as part of best practices. Develop again the on the architecture level, it is ensured that the developer is following that particular design. Then the another validation which is performed is that if the developer is using a duplicate code, so example, for example, if I have to say that I have to search a particular case number, and it goes through 4 steps. but that search needs to happen in different modules, different places. So as a good developer, as a best practice, what I'll do, I'll create a module of it, small module of it, of searching, and then I'll just call that module again and again rather than writing that 10 set of code again and again. So that is something which is checked here when I say after duplicate code. When I say about optimized queries, it can be in terms of SQL queries, that your queries which you have written are most optimized. Other than that, it can also be in terms of the logics, so if-else logics or the loop logic. You have to verify as architect that your code is as much optimized as it can be. Then the rerun logic, that if in case your task fails, how ideally suggested that there should be 2 retries which needs to be done before declaring it as a failure or exception. So you need to make sure that rerun logics are there in place when your bot fails. It should be scalable. We talked about earlier as well, that as much reusable code you will build, it will be easily that much of scalable. So these are interrelated. Then the start stop logic, which means that again your bot is failing or it's reinitiating. What should be the start step? What should be the stop step? So these logic should be there in place. Next one is that the task, which means again on the architecture level of task, you have to make sure that the code is as much modular as possible, which we talked about the login page or the search of the keys. These examples where you ideally build a small module and then reuse those modules again and again if required in your entire process of the bot. Now coming on to the configurability, configurable itself means that this should be as much dynamic, your code should be very much dynamic. And how does that dynamic can be brought into picture is for very first thing is the config file. As however, say n number of inputs which the bot needs, whatever be it be, ensure that all those are being read through the bot in the through config file rather than being hard coded in the bot. We have talked about the benefit about this, right? That the more configurable you make your code, easier it is to modify with the changes which comes up from the business and does not require the logic change of bot. So it is always suggested that your bot should be highly configurable. Next, on the delay, there are legacy applications or certain applications which is very much slow, and there are times where your wait functionalities doesn't work or captures. In that scenario, even if you have to use a delay, you have to make sure that the delay is not too high, like not 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 60 seconds. It should be dynamic. First of all, it should be ideally dynamic. We should use wait for command or wait for screen, wait for object rather than using hardcore delays. And even if you are using delays, you have to see that you are working between milliseconds and seconds. It should say if you have put 1,000 milliseconds versus 1,000 seconds, it's going to be a huge difference, right? So again, you need to be sure about it. I know not everyone does it intentionally, unintentionally. Even if millisecond is converted into seconds, it's going to highly impact the entire bot HD. So you have to make sure that the timers are set correctly. Next one in configuration are the dependencies, which means that uh, as a developer, you have to verify that your task dependencies has been identified and verified before the bot deployment. Example, the mapper files, the config files, everything is in place and attached with the bot. Then the error handling, of course, which means that with the error, say if your bot requires to notify for each case failure to the agents or to the operations that is being done. If in case your process requirement is that it does not require to be notified for each case failure, rather after entire processing of the bot, there is a MIS report, a consolidated run report of the bot, which needs to be sent to the operations. Then you have to make sure that it's being logged into your reporting, and then it is being sent to the stakeholders. So that's where the error handling uh, checks comes into picture. The folder structure, which means again, if you have to follow the set of folder structure, I'll tell you the ideal path where the input is being read and then to create an output. There comes the third folder, which is the second folder, I would rather say. Once the bot input is placed, bot picks the file. It should ideally place into the temporary folder, temp folder, or the processing folder, from where the bot keeps on processing so that no one interrupts that location while the bot is processing. I'll tell you the benefit of it. What happens? Say the input file location. It's usually accessible by the operations person or the person who is placing that input file. So if in case anyone accesses that input file in mid of bot processing, there is a high chance that your bot will fail. However, if your bot reads that input file and pick it up and then place into the processing folder or the temporary folder, that location is something usually on local, and then it ensures that your bot input file is not getting interrupted while the bot is processing it. So there is a temp folder, and once the processing is complete, the file is moved to the output folder or the archive. So whatever be the structure, you have to, as a code review, again, they ensures that you are following these folder structures. Then comes the loop. Loop means that, say example, if you can use for loop or while loop, then you have to make sure that you should ideally use it again because it makes your code dynamic rather than making it number of loops or for time or length, say. Okay, and there should be a terminate condition. So if in case your say bot fails in certain loop, it should ideally come out of that loop, or if it goes, it has to go into the next iteration, it should go, rather than re-looping the same thing again and again, because it will turn your loop into infinite loop and your code will be a big failure. So those kind of scenarios are verified for loops. Then comes the requirement document. Again, it's part of configuration. It is always to verify that your documents list all the exceptions which are handled by code, or the requirements which are part of the document, part of the bot run. It's all documented and listed. Then the run task, which means that your run task is mapped with the variables, again, not hard coded, and your variables are mapped between the run task and subtask. So these things need to be taken care of. Next one is the task. Uh, so the task, which means that it is not having any disposable or unmanaged resources or the folders or anything else. So you have to take care of it. Next one is the closing, disconnect or deleting. So of course your task should be closing. Like example, if you're using error handling, it should end with the closing parameters or the logging method which you have to use. Or say you have opened an Excel, then your connection should always be closed before moving on to the next part of Excel. Or if you're not using that Excel or database connection, that connection needs to be terminated. So you have to take care of it. Then comes the redundant code. Again, the hard-coded value should not be there. The code should be consistent, like the variable naming conventions. If you're following the variable naming convention as starting with small v and following the camel case, it should be easily readable, and the same variable naming convention uh, practice should be followed. So next one is on the supporting all the supporting tasks or subtasks are being called and are available in the target location, so that when your bot runs, it can download it on run machine after deployment. Next one is on variables. So, again, the naming convention should be of standard formats, like we discussed. Small v starting with small v, and then uh, camel following the camel case. And for the list, you can start with the ls, small ls, and then following the camel case. So uh, these naming conventions should be followed as in standard. For again onto the variables, all the commands containing paths are being variabilized. Again, this is part of configurability, that you're not using hard code paths or the values or codes. And yeah, again, when I say about the reset of the variable, which means the counter, say example. So if your counter, your loop is starting first, and when your counter should be set to 0. When the bot retries, again, if it needs to that variable to be reset to 0, it should always be that counter variable should be reset to 0. Then the code handling, like if your Windows, say you are opening an application URL, you should always follow the wildcard, so that even if say something gets added at the end of your URL, your bot should not fail because of it. That's the benefit of wildcard. So anything which comes after, you are sure that www.google.com is going to be consistent, and anything post that can be dynamic. You can just place asterisks after that URL. Then comes debug uh, scenarios where you need to find that comments are there as required, codes are disabled if not required, and it has been removed. Disabled codes are not there because it makes your code clumsy and not easy to read through. Error handlings are properly there, screenshots are being taken and error snapshots are being taken and saved into proper location. Error logs are being maintained as required. Again, onto the logging, there should be event audit log or exit loop criteria. All these things should be captured in your logs. So it's become very important. If you want to verify that your paths are actually the same as required by bot, you need to verify these as well. Then the general things comes in picture where you need to see that your backup is being taken, your bot insights. Again, this is specific to AA or some of the application. Uh, on the commands level, of course, your code should be readable. So that's where the commands comes. The comments come in picture, that your comments are having proper version history, name, date, or who worked onto the code. Then onto the loop, why that loop is being used. So these things ideally comes in foreplay. Then the naming convention, you are following a standard naming convention, you are maintaining the version history. Then comes the security, where you discuss about the username, passwords. It should be all through the credential manager and you're not hard coding it. There should not be a message box, unnecessary message box there. Uh, then uh, whether your task runs or not, what's happening with those tasks. These things are very few things which actually ASA takes in picture, or solution architect or developers takes in picture as part of standard coding best practices. So what next? I hope this would have covered almost all your queries. And in the next video, we'll discuss in detail about the unit testing document, what exactly unit testing document looks like, and how a developer needs to or ideally follow this documentation to make sure their code is best as per the standard practices. So till then, stay healthy, take care of yourself, keep learning and keep growing. Thank you, everyone.